Got Kevin in New York has a question. So I don't know if you're up on this, Paul, but I'm not. So welcome, Kevin. How can we help?
Hey, hey, you guys. Thanks for taking my call. I don't have a question. I have a claim to present to you.
Awesome.
It's something that I think that if you guys will even take some of this information and investigate for yourselves, it'll finally be something that will convince you going towards the existence of God. But my claim was...
Hang on 1 second, Kevin. I want to make sure I understand this, and then I'll give you time to go. You're saying you have a claim that you think will help us find the truth that a God exists, right?
Yes.
Okay. Paul, did you have anything else, or we're going to...
No, I'm just excited.
Cool. So, well, start the clock, and Kevin, the floor is yours, sir.
The claim was that there is science within the Book of Enoch. To really pinpoint where this claim is that the Book of Enoch is describing what we now know as supermassive black holes. Enoch viewed a supermassive black hole, and he's describing it in 3 different verses within the book. The surprising thing is that as someone who's read the book over many times, I never knew that Enoch was talking about a supermassive black hole until the context was revealed to me. It's not very important, but it was by an author who was once atheist and referred it to Christianity. There's 2 different directions I can go with this. I can go into what we know scientifically about supermassive black holes, or I can go right into the verses that are talking about exactly that. But it also has to be kept in mind that Enoch is describing these things within his ability to do so. So it may not sound scientific right off the bat.
So it sounds to me like there exists some text that can be interpreted as if Enoch is describing a supermassive black hole. And nobody was aware of this before we knew about supermassive black holes. And you weren't aware about it until somebody said, hey, what he's describing is a supermassive black hole. But that doesn't mean that there's science in the Bible. And even if it was, how does this demonstrate that a God exists? Let's assume that Enoch, in his limited wisdom, and by the way, this is not a canonical book,
no,
which is weird. But let's assume that Enoch described, to the best of his ability to understand things, a supermassive black hole. How do you show that this is knowledge that came from God? And why couldn't God describe it in such a way that it actually led us to a discovery and understanding of supermassive black holes, rather than only discovering it after we already knew what it was?
Shoot, that's a lot to unpack there. Where to start? Well, I mean, it really does have a little bit to do with where the origins of where this book came from. I believe it's a lot more ancient than this, but you were right that it's not a canonical book, but it was one of many that were, I guess you could say, lost for a while, and then wasn't rediscovered until 1773 within the orthodoxy of the
It seems odd that if this is sufficient to prove that a God exists, that God didn't do anything to protect this book and maintain it as part of canon if it was going to teach us something about science. But the question I asked is, let's assume, I don't need to see exactly what Enoch says, because you've already said that it's in limited language, and so it might be clear. So are we in agreement that it is a matter of interpretation that he is describing a supermassive black hole and not just a matter of fact?
Not at all, because you may not like this answer, but I believe that it was written in a way to keep it a mystery until a time that we could then look back and understand it. Because I realize the implications of, if I'm correct about this, it's really an amazing thing, because
no, it's not.
I realize what it takes to
You're basically
I really,
setting up a scenario where when people say, how do we know that this is what you say it is? Your response is you think it was written in a way to keep it a mystery. So basically, you think God revealed something to Enoch and then hid it only to reveal it later, right?
yes.
Then even if that God
Yes.
exists, even if that God exists, he's completely useless and irrelevant to me. But also, you don't have any way to show that he exists.
Well, just for a moment, man. What I was saying. I mean, I realize the implications behind all this because I mean, I know what it takes to say, going back to my claim, I realize what it takes to even detect something like a supermassive black hole. Now, once a person knows that, what is it about the supermassive black hole that he's describing? It's the 1 second. It's, for one thing, we know scientifically that black holes, not necessarily supermassive ones, are able to capture the gravity of nearby orbiting suns and actually sort of tear them apart little by little. And so using that as a backdrop of what we have detected scientifically, we can then look at the Enoch verses and come to that conclusion that he's talking about exactly that.
So, are all...
Wait, did you say exactly that? Sorry, Paul.
Go ahead. No, you go for it, man.
You just said that he's describing exactly. So it's clear to anybody who understands this that, in fact, Enoch is describing a supermassive black hole. And okay, go ahead, Paul.
All I was going to say was, so there's a lot of things in the Bible that we now retroactively look. So, for example, there's...
I muted you. There's some background noise, but Paul, continue.
There's in the Old Testament, there's a lot of phrases where people talk about God stretching the heavens, for example. And then in more recent days, since Big Bang Theory kind of became adopted and accepted even by the most ardent Christian, that, they now look back and say, oh, stretching the heavens always meant space expanding. Whereas, in the context of the verses, it sure doesn't need to say that. Now, one can, of course, say, sure, I want to interpret this as a multi-layered thing, but what is the marker that we can take to say, you know what, this is not just me interpreting this in hindsight, ad hoc, as something scientific versus something that was definitely intended to be scientific. So, for example, if other books made scientific claims, like say the Quran made some claims and those later turned out could be interpreted in light of science, how do we tell the difference between category A, where it's just something being reinterpreted, and category B, where it was a divine prophecy? What's the marker? How do I know?
I'm glad you said that because this is going to be an example of exactly what I was just talking about, because and how we can use science as a backdrop to understand this. Now, to be more specific, a scientific data that came out as an observer.
No, I don't want to hear about black holes at all. I don't care about black holes that much. What I want to hear is how you tell the difference between something that was intended to be science and something that was just that we're retroactively
let's be clear. I definitely want Paul to get his answer, and it's good, but there's no science here in the book of Enoch. The fact that somebody's describing something doesn't mean they're doing science. There's no scientific methods. There's no nothing. But if we describe something, and you say that the description in these three verses, which I'm assuming are 18:11, 21:3, and 108:4, that in those three verses he's describing a black hole, and Paul's saying, how do you tell when someone is describing something in the Bible that is metaphorical or symbolic or a vision that is not a black hole but might be interpreted as one versus a vision of a black hole? That's what he's asking. So we don't need any information of black holes. We need information about how you can tell that the book of Enoch is accurately describing a black hole versus describing a deep abyss with columns.
Right.
You can tell because the setting was placed. I already told you that Enoch was describing the best that he could, but the setting was placed, which is something that I didn't discover right away.
I don't know what you mean. We're asking for a mechanism. What do you mean the setting was placed?
The setting meaning the location, to be more specific. Because, again, with Enoch explaining this the best he could, had also said somewhere,
right, but the Enuma
where,
Elish, like
this is a place beyond the great earth where the heavens come together.
I'm not concerned about the specifics. I'm concerned about your epistemology right now. So, for example, there are Babylonian, Mesopotamian creation myths that exist that if you squint real hard, some of it sounds like it may accurately line up with new scientific discoveries.
And Muslims say there's Quran has a description of a fetus.
Right.
But it doesn't.
So,
well, I mean, it does,
I guess, I'm super interested in your epistemology. Like, let's not talk about the details about Enoch anymore.
Yeah.
How do you tell, how can I, a non-believer in all this stuff, tell the difference between what was intended to be telling me something true about the natural world that wouldn't be discovered for thousands of years and something that just happens to sound like it? How can I tell? Without referencing Enoch at all.
Just further investigation of it, because to make it seem like I'm not cherry picking, which I know it does seem like it does come off that way. It comes from a background of considering a whole bunch of other things. Like, for example, I do believe that in such a way that this book was protected because because it was lost for a while. And
we're done, Kevin, and I'm gonna we're done,
done.
Kevin, and I'm going to explain why. Paul just asked you for a method, and you rambled for a minute, and then you said you were going to give the method. You made a statement that was like it, and the response right after that was, like, for example, and then you went on to talk about what you think about the book. It doesn't seem that you have. So here's the thing. First of all, you're calling about a book that's not canonical, that's not considered, part of the canon at all. You suspect that it was hidden, but the three verses. Am I correct that it's 1811, 21:3, and 1084?
Yes, that's right.
Sure. So verse 1811 says, "And I saw a deep abyss with columns of heavenly fire, and among them I saw columns of fire fall, which were beyond measure, alike toward the height and toward the depth." That doesn't describe a supermassive black hole. And it's more, I mean, even if you turn your head sideways and squint and make it blurry, that still doesn't get you to a black hole. 21:3 says, "And there I saw 7 stars of the heaven bound together in it, like great mountains and burning with fire." Now that's cool, except that doesn't place it as necessarily outside of the earth. You can see the stars from there. But why 7 stars? This is parable language. This is the language where we're going to put a number in, and it's always going to be 7 or 6 or 13 or 12, or, the ones that are important, and 40. And then 1084 says, "And I saw there something like an invisible cloud, for by reason of its depth I could not look over. And I saw a flame of fire blazing brightly, and things like shining mountains circling and sweeping to and fro." That's really cool language, but there's no reason to think that Enoch was actually describing a black hole. There's no reason to think that Enoch would have known he was describing a black hole. And if in fact he understood or was given the understanding of a supermassive black hole by God, then God failed to give him decent language. So why would God go to all the trouble to hide a book that doesn't achieve the goal that you think it achieves? Why would God fail to give Enoch a reason? Like, if you're going to hide a book so that in a couple thousand years it turns out that this is clear proof of you, why wouldn't Enoch have written, "God is going to hide these words and they will be discovered, and people will understand that in the depths of the expansive space are massive, blah, blah, blah," and then go on to describe something that's actually like a black hole. But the other reason that we're done is because at the very beginning of this, I said that let's assume that Enoch has actually described a supermassive black hole. How? So I'm going to grant you everything here, Kevin. I'm no more of the other questions. I'm just going to say, for the sake of this argument, let's assume that Enoch in his book said, we'll do both parts. I have been given a vision by God of a supermassive black hole, and and here's the description, and God's going to hide these words for 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years, whatever it is. Even if the book of Enoch said that, how would that prove that there was in fact a God?
It would prove that there's a God because, I mean, look what it took for us to discover a supermassive black hole.
Not an answer.
We haven't even known. We haven't even known the existence of a black hole for more than, I want to say, 150 years. It would prove that Enoch is a prophet.
No, it wouldn't. It wouldn't prove any of these things. None of this is proved. None of this is proved by pointing to a book that looks like it knew something. Because how did you rule out time travel?
And how I even came to the conclusion that these are black holes that he's describing?
No. Wow. How did you get that from the question I just asked? I asked you, how did you rule out time travel?
Well, it's a vision. So,
wow. Okay. How did you rule out someone traveling back in time and writing a book in the context of a vision about the future? How did you rule out time travel?
There's no time travel needed in this.
No, that's not what I asked, Kevin. How did you conclude that God is a better explanation for how Enoch could have known this than that time travel is a better explanation for how Enoch could have known this? Meanwhile, we haven't even shown Enoch knew anything, but how did you rule out time travel?
I don't know.
Yeah,
right.
You don't know.
Or that Enoch had the technology before, like this was sorry,
Paul.
I was going to say this is pre-flood, right? Enoch was Noah's father, if I remember correctly. So maybe they actually had the same technology we had back, before the flood destroyed it all. And that they literally had.
I'm not saying that.
How did you rule that out?
I'm not saying that.
I love that now you're saying, I'm not saying that there's no proof of that. There's no proof of any of this. That's the point. You have a model about the book of Enoch that could lead to at least one of two different explanations: that Enoch received a prophecy from a god, or that Enoch received a prophecy from a time traveler, or that Enoch himself was a time traveler, or that someone else was a time traveler and actually conveyed this information and it just got labeled as Enoch, or that none of this shit actually happened. Show which one of those five, and there's probably dozens more, is most likely, and why you think that God of those five is most likely.
I don't know where to start with all that.
Well, I tell you what, we'll drop it here. We'll go on and take some other calls. You figure out where to start, and then call us back to show why a non-canonical book that isn't part of any of the relevant religions has a passage in it that, in hindsight, someone can say looks a little bit like it might be describing a supermassive black hole, and therefore God is the most probable explanation for that. Work on it. Call us back.
It's because of the implications behind.
I said work on it and call it back. Call us back. Thanks.
The trouble, of course, it would have been nice if Enoch would have done something more relevant that more people would have known about. That, so if Enoch could have told us about the plan of salvation written before.
Uh-oh, Paul froze up. Oh, there he is. You're back.
Oh, shoot, got lost. All I was saying was that the plan of salvation is a much more important thing for God to reveal to people than super black holes.